Good afternoon to all of those on the East Coast. Good morning to those on the West Coast and Central Time Zone. As well, to those following us from Israel, from Europe, and parts abroad, we want to wish you a good evening. Today we have back with us probably the most popular speaker, the most popular person on these briefings. And that, of course, is Jonathan Schanzer. Jonathan Schanzer is the executive director of FDD, the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy. FDD is used by those on the Foreign Affairs Committee in the Senate and the House. FDD, their research, their analysis is used by think tanks, by the Trump administration, the Biden administration before them. And before Jonathan's role at FDD, Jonathan worked for the Treasury Department. The sanctions that have prevented Iran from having nuclear breakout capability, those sanctions are a direct consequence of the work that Jonathan did over the years. The reason we all love listening and learning from Jonathan, and besides having a chance to hear from him at FIDF, Jonathan has a podcast that comes out multiple times a week, and you can listen to him on his podcast. But his analysis, his assessment, his ability to contextualize is something that those who participate on our briefings find incredibly, incredibly meaningful. And Jonathan, we want to thank you for taking the time, the energy to address us. If you could give us your perspective on what's happening all around, whether it's Iran, Yemen, whether it's Syria, Egypt, whatever you'd like to speak about. Obviously, you'll have a lot to say about Gaza, but to hear your assessment on things.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you. As always, wonderful to be with you and your terrific audience. I continue to get just terrific feedback every time I appear with you, Steve. So thank you for the opportunity. Yeah, look, I think that right now the war is at this very strange crossroads, and we've been sort of sitting at a yellow light or maybe even a red light for quite some time. I think that what we first need to understand is that a lot of the fronts have gone quiet. What's happening in Lebanon right now, for example, I think is actually very heartening. We've watched Hezbollah shrink in terms of its capabilities and its willingness to engage in adventurism. A mechanism right now exists and is operating quite nicely between the Israelis, the Lebanese government, and the U.S. government. This is something that was set up by Morgan Ortagus. She's the deputy to Stephen Witkoff. She's created a mechanism where when the Israelis identify threats out of Lebanon, they identify Hezbollah movements, they call it in. And the Lebanese armed forces have an opportunity, if they wish, to address that threat. And if not, well, then the Israelis take care of business. And the IDF has been striking with drones, with aircraft at Hezbollah targets as they emerge. And this has actually served to benefit both Israel and Lebanon. Every target that Israel hits is a target that the Lebanese armed forces are then able to gain control of. And we're watching them expand their ability to control Lebanon writ large. Now, it's not over by a long shot, but I am watching some very positive developments. And there's actually something new that's occurred as well. The Palestinian Authority, which of course we don't trust very much, but they have now been engaging with the Lebanese government, with the Lebanese armed forces. They're going to start to clear out the jihadi groups, the Palestinian jihadi groups. There are 12 of these camps that exist across Lebanon. They call them refugee camps. Obviously, these are not refugees in the true sense of the word, but they've maintained that title thanks to UNRWA and thanks to the policies of the Lebanese government. But what's going to happen now is that Hamas, Islamic Jihad, PFLP, and all the alphabet soup of terrorist groups, Palestinian terrorist groups, are going to be disarmed. If things go the way that everything is planned, what we're going to actually see is a further de-radicalization, if it works out properly, out of Lebanon. So a lot happening there, and I think very interesting to watch. Obviously, next door in Syria, also it's gone quiet, and we've seen the new regime in Syria, which I don't trust. but they have started to dismantle some of the radical Palestinian jihadi groups. Now, the regime itself is radical jihadi roots based in Al-Qaeda and in ISIS and in a range of other bad actors that have been operating in the Sunni jihadi space. But what we're seeing right now is a pragmatic government under the influence of the Trump administration, maybe even under some pressure from the Trump administration, also the Saudis. What we're watching right now is a government that is trying to demonstrate its pragmatism. This has been rewarded by sanctions relief provided by the Trump administration. I think it was premature. I think that it probably shouldn't have happened right away, but I will say that we are in the midst of a remarkable experiment. If it pays off well, well, then we will see something that even could be normalization between Israel and the new regime in Syria. If it goes poorly, we will watch the rise of a jihadi state. But in the meantime, right now, things appear to be rather quiet and under control. So again, out of those 7 fronts that we were watching 6, 8 months ago, where it really looked like it was chaotic, right now we're seeing 2 of those that have been, I think, brought to heel. Iraq, since the re-election of Donald Trump, all of the jihadi activity, the Shiite militia activity out of Iraq has gone quiet as well. So that's a 3rd front that's gone quiet. Now let's talk about some of the more hot fronts, because I think these are important to watch. So first, Judea and Samaria, West Bank, as some people call it. We've watched a drop-off in some of the violent activity. There was a significant drop year over year that the IDF reported. That is, I think, the good news. The bad news is that we're still seeing a lot of armed gangs and terrorist groups. They're being supplied by the Iranians, who have been using the very long and porous border with Jordan to resupply and to bring in all these weapons. And by the way, also drugs, also cash. We're seeing just a huge amount of illicit activity. And this has prompted the Jordanians and the Israelis, with urging from the US and others, to begin to build a fence. Now, it's 260 miles. It's a long border, Steve. So what we're watching right now is an effort to start this process. I think the first phase is going to be about 50 miles, and then they'll have to go back and build more yet again. The challenge right now on Jordan's border is that when you build this fence, it becomes a physical political boundary. And this is something that the Israeli left and the Israeli right will not agree on, right? The Palestinians may not like the trajectory. The Jordanians themselves may not like the trajectory of this boundary. So we'll have to be watching very carefully in the months ahead as this boundary is set, because it will have real world ramifications when this border is built. So that's something to watch. But I think overall, West Bank seems to be under control. That is, I think, full credit to the IDF reservists. They are the ones who've been called up more than any other to serve in the West Bank, and they seem to be doing an excellent job there. Judea and Samaria, again, seem rather quiet. Now, a couple of other fronts to sort of talk through here, Steve. One is, of course, Yemen. This bothers me greatly because we continue to see ballistic missile fire. The Israelis continue to shoot down those ballistic missiles. That's the good news. You're not seeing any harm done to Israelis. Of course, you are seeing some people as they're scrambling to get to shelters. We've seen accidents. When I was in Israel a couple of months ago, I was literally on the highway as a missile was coming in. And as my taxi started to pull over to the side of the road, as everyone is instructed to do, we were hit from behind by a motorcyclist who then went flying off his motorcycle. This is just one example of the kinds of things that can happen even when the missiles don't fall with a direct hit in Israel. It creates chaos. People get injured. People get hurt. So it's not as if any of this is harmless. But here's the bigger picture. This is like target practice for the Houthis. They keep getting better at directing these missiles. They're probing Israeli missile defense. And by the way, the missile defense is insanely expensive. Every interceptor that Israel launches to knock out these Houthi missiles from the sky, each one of these is $3 to $5 million. Arrow 3 is not a cheap system, and we continue to watch because there is concern about just how many Israel has. So this cannot continue. Israel has to figure out how to solve this. And one way that that could happen, and I'm not saying it's the right way, but the Houthis keep saying that they're going to continue to fire as long as the war in Gaza continues. And that brings us to Gaza. Whether the Gaza war is still in Israel's interest. I'm not saying Israel should stop fighting in Gaza because of the Houthis. I think that the Israelis obviously have their strategic objectives in Gaza, and they're going to continue to fight. And we've seen a significant deployment of IDF troops that have gone in. As of last week, they controlled something like 50% of the Gaza Strip. That's significant. And the plans were to continue to expand those operations and to destroy Hamas bit by bit. Now, but there is, I think, a question of at what point does Israel still need to do this? And I think that's the interesting debate that's emerging out of Israel right now, Steve, that 70% of Israelis want the war to end. And by the way, something like 80% of Gazans say they want to leave Gaza so that it can be rebuilt. So, I guess the question that we're all asking ourselves is how much more fighting needs to get done here in order for Israel to feel safe. Now, of course, we see continued occasional rocket fire. And of course, there are these horrific sniper attacks and bombings that occasionally do claim the lives of IDF soldiers and injure IDF soldiers. I don't know if we're ever going to be able to stop all of Hamas's capabilities completely. I think that is just not a realistic approach. But I do think that, Hamas is significantly weakened, way weaker than it was on October 6th of 23. So the question is, how much weaker does it need to be? And can Israel declare victory after having dismantled, let's say, 3/4 of their capabilities or whatever that amount is? I don't know what the calculus is from the Israeli perspective, but I do know that the conversation is still percolating in Israel about how to end all of this. Now, last front that I think we need to address, and that's, of course, Iran. That's the big one. Now, as we all know, Iran's air defenses were destroyed back in October of last year. Their strategic air defenses are down, and they're still not back up. I'm not sure how long it will take for the regime to be able to reconstitute. But even if it does, the Israelis clearly have the technical capability. Their Air Force is able to destroy those S-300, Russian-made S-300 air systems. This is the good news. The bad news is that the Israelis, I think, are chomping at the bit right now, where they clearly have identified an opportunity to perhaps even destroy Iran's nuclear program. And we're watching international politics get in the way. And by that, I mean that the Trump administration has opened up this dialogue with the regime. They're negotiating with the Islamic Republic about the trajectory of this nuclear program. This has tied the hands of the IDF. They cannot clash with the Trump administration. They've agreed to give the Trump administration the time and space to let Stephen Witkoff conduct these discussions in Oman and in Rome. And look, I don't think anybody has a problem with saying give peace a chance. I think the question is, will this be a good deal? Or will this be the JCPOA, the highly controversial and flawed Obama nuclear deal of 2015? Will it be a revival of that in some way? Will this be Obama 2.0? That is the major concern out of Israel right now. And there have been reports over the last week or so, Steve, where the Israelis have reportedly started to make plans to take care of this themselves. In other words, at one point, I think they had hoped that the Obama administration, or rather, the Trump administration, was ready to join them in perhaps taking out, the deeply embedded elements of the Iran nuclear program. The stuff that's deep inside a mountain, hundreds of meters deep inside reinforced concrete and the like. This is, I think, the big question now. Will Israel try to do this alone? And maybe I'll just end here. There's a couple ways that this could work. One is that Israel deliberately acts against the wishes of the Trump administration. And we've seen this in history, not in recent history, but when you look at the 1956 Sinai campaign, it was done in contravention to American policy at the time. And this actually brought about a significant condemnation from the United States, the Eisenhower administration. The Israelis don't want this because, of course, they rely significantly on American assistance and American weapons. You don't want to cross the administration in that way. So then comes the second scenario, which is the Osirak attack of 1981, where the Israelis took out the Saddam Hussein's nuclear reactor. It was done surreptitiously. It was done, it was a secret plan that was brought into action. They bombed the reactor, and publicly we saw condemnation from the United States, from the Reagan administration, but privately it was sort of high fives for the Israelis because they had taken out a threat to the international system, and they had done so successfully, which is, I think, really important here. If you're going to go take a shot at this program, you better get it right. Now, the last scenario, which this is what you hope for more than anything else, is close coordination between the United States and Israel. This is what we saw in 2007 when the Israelis took out the Syrian Al-Kibar reactor. This was done in close coordination between the Israeli government and the Bush administration. The Bush administration understood what was going on, and they provided a bit of guidance, even as the Israelis took care of it themselves. So there's a lot of different ways that this thing could go. Look, I think best case scenario is that Iran agrees to relinquish its nuclear program and stops supporting terrorism, stops its war against Israel, stops its war against the West. I just don't see that happening. I think the likelihood of that is very low, which then starts to raise the question of whether Israel needs to take action on its own. And that is that intersection that we sit at right now.
The Houthis with the Iranian ballistic missiles. So we are hearing that they probably have somewhere still between 40 to 60 of those, which, as you said, you're looking at $3 million a pop just to take them down. That's assuming that you're successful with it. That's a fortune of money, and it takes, as you know, it takes a long time to create these Arrow 3 missiles, the Chetz Gimel missiles. Any sense of what you're hearing that we've been able to, either America, Israel has undermined their infrastructure, has prevented their port system, their air system from receiving any more of these ballistic missiles? What do you hear in terms of what's happening militarily, where Israel and America are on the offensive as opposed to defending against the missiles?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think part of what's going on here, Steve, and I got to say, it's been a controversial issue as we watch this play out. But of course, the Trump administration was striking Houthi targets. Right, it was a full-blown campaign to weaken and degrade the Houthis. And then right before Donald Trump took his trip to the Middle East, he dispatched Stephen Witkoff, who was able to secure an agreement where the Houthis said, okay, we're not going to be firing at U.S. ships any longer. And a side deal was struck. This is essentially what played out, that the administration was able to secure a deal where they said, okay, we're no longer the targets, therefore we don't need to be fighting any longer. So the U.S. begins to leave. It actually it left two problems. One is that British ships apparently continue to be hit, as well as other ships that are going through the Red Sea. The Houthis can continue to target them. It's just no longer a U.S. problem. And then there's the other part of this, which is that ballistic missiles continue to fly at Israel. The Israelis have struck back, as we know, but what we've learned is that even after the Israelis took out the airport in Sana'a, in the capital of Houthi-controlled territory, it knocked the airport offline for a time, but now the airport's working again, and that means that missile parts are likely coming in. And the seaport, which Israel has also struck, that the United States has also struck, this is Houdeida, as it's called, it has also been able to, essentially rebuild, replenish, and now we're watching missile parts or entire missiles in some cases coming in. So Israel has this challenge where it needs to strike Houthi territory. It needs to continue to degrade Houthi territory. But as we know, this is like 1,000 miles that the IAF will need to traverse. It means refueling midair and then dropping, 2,000-pound bombs on specific targets. And they can do that, but it's complicated, it's expensive, it's dangerous, it's unsustainable to have these sorts of airdrops, basically dropping these weapons on a sustained basis. This actually does raise some interesting questions, Steve, that I've heard about, where the Israelis are looking at possible places to build airstrips in the Horn of Africa. And I would say that this is something to watch, maybe not over the next 2 months, but certainly over the next 2 years, that you could begin to see the Israelis operating terrestrially out of East Africa, out of the Horn of Africa, whether it's Ethiopia, whether it's Somaliland, which is, of course, not even a state yet, but they, I think, would be probably very open to working with the Israelis. The UAE already has a base there, and and so do a couple of other countries operating smaller airstrips. But that could be something for the Israelis to think about as well. But we've not yet solved for this problem with the Houthis. And again, as long as the war in Gaza continues, the Houthis have vowed to continue firing these missiles. So it's a two-front war right now, if you really think about it, much reduced from 7 fronts, but it does not make it easy for Israel at this point.
Israel, as you mentioned, controls over 50% of the Gaza Strip right now. And I'm reading that it's potentially looking at controlling over 75% of Gaza. If that's the case, what does that do to Hamas's capabilities?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question. I think, look, the first thing that you need to understand is that the capabilities are terrible right now for Hamas. I mean, look, again, they are still able to attack Israeli soldiers because it's urban warfare. It's a complex battle environment going house to house, and certainly not even, functioning houses, right? You're looking at a huge amount of destruction, and it's not easy for the IDF to traverse this. And this is where Hamas is able to play. They're able to pop up from tunnels. They're able to pop out from destroyed infrastructure. But this doesn't require significant training. It does not entail anything sophisticated on the part of Hamas. What we understand is actually that the recruitment continues, that they're still getting thousands of people to join the fight, but these are like young men in tracksuits picking up AK-47s. And by the way, the numbers, from at least from what I hear from one source of ours, the age of the fighters continues to drop. So maybe before the war, we were looking at the average age of a Hamas fighter being in their 20s. Now we're looking at possibly late teens, and that's a remarkable thing to watch as well. It's a sad thing when you think about it, because it means that Hamas is still able to recruit from the Gaza population. You understand why. They're angry at Israel. They want to fight. They think they're defending their homeland, but this is a futile battle for them, if you ask me. And so as the Israelis continue to populate the Philadelphia corridor, the Morag corridor, the Netzarim corridor, these are the corridors that run east-west across the Gaza Strip. And as Israel continues to thrust into the Gaza Strip and to attack known positions of Hamas, you're going to continue to see the degradation of this Iran-backed terror group. But the question becomes, can we actually envision a moment where Israel is able to plant a flag and say, we now control this. Hamas, you've been defeated. I think it's hard. I think it's still very difficult. What we really need is I think we need to see a surrender by Hamas. We need to see them agree to do something along the lines of what Ronald Reagan was able to engineer for the PLO out of Lebanon in the early 1980s, right? Where the PLO agreed to be deported to Tunisia. That was the way that Yasser Arafat eventually survived. I'm not saying that it worked out perfectly because obviously Yasser Arafat was able to revive his career and tried to pass himself off as a statesman and a Nobel Prize laureate and all of that. But it did end the war in Lebanon. And I think what we really do want to see is an end to the war in Gaza. We want to see Hamas capitulate. And for that, this is where I think Stephen Witkoff, Donald Trump, the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Qataris, who I don't trust as far as I can throw them, the Egyptians, they need to all be leaning on Hamas right now, saying, you are bringing nothing but suffering to the 1.8 million people still in the Gaza Strip. You have to stand down. You have to end this war. But this is the standoff that we're watching right now. The Israelis are refusing to relent. They do not want to blink first, and so the fighting continues.
Do you hear anything in terms of any countries that are willing to take 80% of people in the Gaza Strip want to leave? They want out. Do you hear any? It's the Sunni Arab world hates the Palestinians. They despise, they don't trust the Palestinians. They view them as snakes, as liars, as thieves. Nobody wants them. So do you hear, is there anyone that's willing to take them?
Right now the answer is no, Steve. I mean, we know that I think something like 10,000 Gazan children and their families were moved to Jordan so that they could get medical treatment, those that were in need. And I think it's great that the Jordanians did this, but there's no way the Jordanians are going to take in more Palestinians. That country is 85% Palestinian origin. That's the citizenry there. They cannot afford to have more of this, right? So that is, I think, that's off the table. The Egyptians continue to mobilize their military in ways that are actually threatening to Israel, right? We're watching significant military maneuvering in the Sinai. That is actually a direct response to Israel or the United States calling for the Palestinians to be transferred to the Sinai. The Egyptians want nothing to do with it. They insist that this is one of their big red lines. So that's not happening. There was a moment where we were hearing that the Libyans might be willing to take in some Gazan civilians. They're apparently not interested any longer, if they ever were. So we continue to hear about these possible plans, but all of them seem to fall through. I continue to hold that there may be some Muslim countries in sub-Saharan Africa or maybe in Central Asia. These are the Muslim countries that are not Arab. And I think that's a big difference maker here, that Arabs have this sclerotic and deeply dysfunctional view of the Palestinians. This is something that they've held since the late 1940s, early 1950s, this idea that somehow no Palestinian should ever leave territory that has been set aside for the Palestinian National Project. So obviously, West Bank, Gaza Strip, these are the territories that the Palestinians claim. These people are basically stuck there as far as the Arab world is concerned, that they cannot leave. They have to continue to fight for their liberation. And this has become deeply dysfunctional. We know, obviously, how this has fared for the Palestinians over time. It's been one disaster after another. And a lot of it has been because the Arabs have pushed the Palestinians into this position, and now they can't step back from this out of national pride or Arab nationalist pride. And this is the deeply dysfunctional place that we're in. If we're to be honest, Palestinians should leave. They should have an opportunity to go wherever they want, because they're no longer refugees in the truer sense of the word. Now, if they're saying that they're refugees from Gaza and they want to go back to Gaza after there's reconstruction, okay. But I think we still need to come to terms with the damage that UNRWA has done, the UN Relief and Works Agency, where they've identified, hundreds of, I mean, it's actually 5 million people right now before the war were identified as refugees because they had left, Jaffa or Haifa in a war that they started and weren't able to finish. And so we have this highly dysfunctional dynamic right now that does need to be addressed, and it's compounded by the desire of many people to leave the Gaza Strip because it's just uninhabitable in many ways.
Jonathan, we want to thank you. Thank you for your assessment, your analysis. Look, we should probably see some very significant movement in the next couple of months, because either they're going to capitulate or Israel's going to have to do the job that it needed to do from the start. And that is to put an end to Hamas's military capabilities, to basically snuff out their weapons, snuff out their leadership, and break them. Unless we see some kind of a deal where Hamas's back is to the wall, that they have no choice but to make some kind of a deal, they're bringing death and destruction on their own people because of their arrogance and their unwillingness to give back the innocent hostages that they've taken.
It's a tragedy, Steve. I mean, it really is, because you can see now that Hamas dragged all of the Gaza Strip, in fact, all of the Arab world, into a war on October 7th. And this was something I think that the Israeli intelligence apparatus could not foresee. But now, I think Israel, as we've discussed today, has control over a lot of those fronts, and that's great. But we still have this unfinished business in Gaza, and the people are suffering as a result of this unfinished business. We've got unfinished business in Yemen as a result of the continued war, and the unfinished business in Yemen itself, because the U.S. did not finish off the Houthis, and nor have the Israelis, at least not yet. But remember, the big picture right now, the big picture are these Iran negotiations. If the Iranians are forced to dismantle their nuclear program, and they are forced to shut down the proxy network that they've been operating, that's the big win. And that's the big thing that Israel is watching right now. All of the rest of this, as they say in Israel, it looks like kesef katan, as they say, small change, right? This does not feel like they're looking primarily at the existential battles. The Houthi stuff, still, strategic threats to Israel, these missiles coming in. And Hamas, I would say it's strategic as well, because it's impacting Israel's standing on in the international community. But when you think about the major threats posed to Israel right now, Iran is the biggest one out there, and it's the thing that Israel is still watching the most carefully. And this is why the Stephen Witkoff-led negotiations are so important right now, especially for Witkoff to hold the line as it relates to American demands about the nuclear program, but also about some of the other malign activity that has characterized the Iranian regime for so long.
Jonathan, thank you. Thank you for everything that you're doing, that FTD is doing, and we are very, very grateful. Hopefully, we pray that we will see better days. We pray that ultimately this evil under Iran and its 8 proxies has been defeated. We've seen in the last year incredible strides. We've seen a sea change that we could have never have dreamed of. But as you said, we still have Iran in a very, very dangerous situation. We still have the Houthis, and we still have problems in Gaza. But we thank you. Thank you for being a voice of clarity, a voice of morality, and a beacon of light in what unfortunately is a very confused gray world. And wishing you, your family, a wonderful week.
Thanks, Steve.